As I walked into the house that evening, the first thing that struck me was the eerie silence. Morningside Avenue was usually filled with the hum of activity, with Mags, my wife of 15 years, usually at the center of it, either chatting on the phone or watching her favorite TV show. But tonight was different. The only sound I could hear was the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantelpiece. I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter and glanced around, expecting to see Mags prepping dinner or lounging on the couch. Instead, the house was empty. Confused, I reached for my phone, hoping to find a message from her. As I swiped the screen, a notification caught my eye. A text message on Mag's phone, which was left on the dining table. I wouldn't normally snoop, but something about the text unsettled me. It was from an unknown number, and the preview read, "I can't wait to see you again tonight. Meet me at the usual spot." My heart skipped a beat. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind as I grabbed her phone and unlocked it, my hands trembling. The full message was even worse than I'd imagined. It read, "I can't stop thinking about last night. Meet me at the usual spot on the beach. I'll bring the wine." I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was reading. Mags? My Mags? The woman I had built a life with? The woman I trusted more than anyone in this world? She couldn't possibly be involved in something like this. There had to be some mistake. But as I stood there, the truth began to sink in. The late-night shifts at the bar, the sudden changes in her schedule, the way she'd become more distant lately. It all started to make sense. My mind raced back to the countless nights I'd spent alone, waiting for her to come home, wondering why she'd been so distant. All those doubts I'd brushed aside, all the excuses I'd made for her, now felt like a cruel joke. I needed to know more. My chest tightened as I scanned through her messages, looking for anything that could explain this. But there was nothing. No names, no other details, just vague mentions of the usual spot and last night. I tried to breathe, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me. As I stared at the phone, anger surged through me. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I knew I couldn't just go in blindly. If she was cheating on me, I needed proof, something undeniable that would reveal the truth. With a heavy heart, I set her phone back down and walked to the window. The sky was darkening, the last rays of sunlight disappearing over the horizon. My mind was already forming a plan. Tonight I would follow her, see where she went, and find out what was really going on. I turned away from the window and grabbed my car keys. This was the beginning of a journey I never imagined I'd have to take, a journey that would lead me into the heart of a betrayal I wasn't sure I could survive. I parked my car a few blocks away from the beach bar where Mags worked. The lights from the bar flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the sand. I had never felt so out of place in a spot I'd visited countless times before. This was supposed to be a place of joy, a place where we shared drinks, laughter, and summer memories. But tonight it was tainted, just like everything else in my life. I checked my watch. 9:30 p.m. Mags's shift was supposed to end at 10 o'clock. I leaned back in my seat, trying to keep my breathing steady. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. My mind wandered, replaying every interaction I'd had with Mags over the past few months. Had I missed the signs? Was I so blind that I couldn't see my own wife slipping away? Finally, I saw her. Mags walked out of the bar, her hair pulled back in that casual way she always did after a long shift. She looked tired, but there was something else in her expression, something I hadn't seen in a long time: excitement. She wasn't alone. A man followed her out, a tall, broad-shouldered guy with a confident swagger. Even from this distance, I could see how close they were standing, how his hand brushed against her arm as they spoke. I felt a surge of anger rise up inside me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to see this through. Mags and the man, this must be B, walked down the beach, disappearing into the shadows. I started the car and followed at a safe distance, careful not to let my headlights give me away. The night was still, the only sound the distant crash of the waves against the shore. After a few minutes, they stopped near a secluded spot by the rocks, just out of sight from the main road. I parked the car and got out, quietly making my way closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept through the darkness, every muscle in my body tensed. I could hear their voices now, low and hushed. The man was laughing, and then Mags's voice, soft and playful, responding to him. My stomach turned as I moved closer, crouching behind a large rock for cover. I peered around the edge, and there they were, sitting on the sand, a bottle of wine between them. They were too close, too comfortable with each other. And then it happened. B leaned in and kissed her. She didn't resist. Instead, she kissed him back, her hands wrapping around his neck as if she'd done it 1,000 times before. My worst fears were confirmed. A wave of nausea hit me as I stumbled back, my mind spinning. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had seen enough. I turned and made my way back to the car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. My marriage was over, and I had no idea what to do next. The drive home was a blur. The road ahead of me was dark, but not as dark as the thoughts swirling in my mind. I could barely process what I had just seen. Mags, the woman I had loved and trusted for so many years, was cheating on me, openly, shamelessly, as if our life together meant nothing. When I finally pulled into the driveway, the house looked different, colder, emptier. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to punch something, to do anything to release the rage boiling inside me. But instead, I just sat there, numb. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more. More proof, more information, more time to figure out my next move. She would be home soon, and I had to act normal, pretend like everything was fine. I wasn't ready to tip my hand. The clock on the dashboard read 11 p.m. She would be back any minute. I took a deep breath and forced myself to go inside. The silence in the house was deafening. I headed to the kitchen and poured myself a drink, the amber liquid burning as it slid down my throat. I heard the front door open, followed by the familiar sound of Mags's footsteps. My heart raced as I braced myself. "Hey, honey," she called out, her voice light and cheerful. "I'm home." I clenched my jaw, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Hey, Mags, how was work?" Same old, she said, walking into the kitchen. She leaned in to kiss me, but I turned away, pretending to reach for something on the counter. She didn't seem to notice. Or if she did, she didn't say anything. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water and sat down at the table. "How about you?" she asked, taking a sip. "How was your day?" "Busy," I replied, keeping my answers short, not trusting myself to say much more. "Just a lot of work." She nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Maybe guilt, maybe suspicion. I couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. I had a mission now, and I wouldn't let anything stand in my way. Over the next few days, I began to gather more information, carefully, methodically, without raising her suspicions. I checked her phone whenever I had the chance, reading through her messages and noting the times she would stay late at work. I watched her closely, studying every move she made, every word she said. I even managed to get access to the security footage from the bar, thanks to a friend who worked in IT. What I saw on those tapes confirmed everything I had feared. Mags and B, laughing, flirting, touching each other like they were the only two people in the world. My blood boiled with every second of footage, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep collecting evidence. I wasn't just going to confront her. I was going to expose her for what she was, a liar, a cheat, someone who had betrayed everything we had built together. And when the time was right, I would make sure she paid for what she had done. But for now, I had to wait. The game wasn't over yet. The days dragged on like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Every morning I put on the mask of a loving husband, pretending that everything was fine while I continued to gather evidence. Mags had no idea. She carried on as usual, smiling, laughing, and going about her day as if nothing was wrong. The sight of her acting so normal, so carefree, made my blood boil. But I knew I had to stay calm. The moment of confrontation was coming, and I needed to be ready. One night, after another of her late shifts, I decided it was time. Mags walked in, her hair tousled from the wind, a slight smile on her lips. I watched her from the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. She sat down beside me, oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. "How was work?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "Good," she replied, not meeting my eyes. "A bit slow tonight." I nodded, my mind racing. I knew what I had to do, but it didn't make it any easier. "Mags, we need to talk." She looked at me, her smile faltering. "About what?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "About us. About what's been going on. Her eyes widened slightly and I saw a flash of something, fear maybe, in her expression. What do you mean? I mean the late nights, the secrecy, the way you've been acting lately, I said, leaning forward. I know, Mags. I know about you and B. The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the air between us thick with tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake, I can explain. Explain what? I snapped, the anger I'd been holding back finally breaking through. Explain how you've been lying to me for God knows how long, how you've been sneaking around behind my back, cheating on me with some guy from the bar. She flinched at my words, tears welling up in her eyes. But I didn't care. I was too far gone, too hurt, too angry to feel any sympathy for her. Jake, please, just let me save it. I cut her off, standing up and glaring down at her. I've seen everything, Mags. The texts, the phone calls, the security footage. I know what you've been doing, and I know who you've been doing it with. She stared at me, her eyes wide with shock and fear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered everything she had done, everything she had thrown away, and the pity vanished. I trusted you, I said, my voice shaking with anger. I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me? She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Get out, I said, my voice cold and emotionless. I don't want to see you anymore. Without another word, she got up and left the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing through the empty house. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. I had done it. I had confronted her, and now there was no going back. In the days that followed our confrontation, Mags tried reaching out to me multiple times. Texts, calls, voicemails. But I ignored them all. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. I was done with her lies. But I wasn't done with getting to the bottom of everything. I needed to know more. How long this had been going on. Where they had met. How deep this betrayal really ran. That's when I decided to hire a private detective. I found one online, a guy named Frank Mitchell, who came highly recommended. He was an older man with a gruff voice and a no-nonsense attitude. After a brief phone call, we arranged to meet in his office downtown. When I walked in, the place was exactly what I expected. Dimly lit, with walls lined with old case files and a desk cluttered with papers. Frank was sitting behind it, his eyes sharp and focused as he looked up at me. Jake Harris, right? He asked, extending a hand. Yeah, I replied, shaking his hand. Thanks for seeing me on such short notice. No problem, he said, motioning for me to sit down. So, what's the story? I hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and told him everything. About Mags, the texts, the late-night shifts, the guy she was seeing. B. Frank listened intently, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Sounds like you've got a pretty clear case of infidelity on your hands. Yeah, I said, my voice tight with anger. But I need more. I need proof, dates, times, places. I want to know how long this has been going on, and I want to know everything about this guy. Frank nodded again, his eyes narrowing. I can do that. I'll start digging into her background, see what I can find. And I'll keep an eye on her from now on. Track her movements. See where she goes when she's not with you. Good, I said, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. How long will it take? Hard to say, Frank replied. Depends on how careful she's been. But don't worry, I'm good at what I do. If there's something to find, I'll find it. I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. Thanks, Frank. I appreciate it. No problem, he said, standing up and walking me to the door. I'll be in touch as soon as I have something. As I left his office, I felt a strange mix of emotions, anger, sadness, and a burning desire for justice. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, and I was going to make sure that Mags and B got exactly what they deserved. Weeks passed, and I did my best to keep up appearances. I went to work, came home, and tried to live my life as normally as possible, but inside, I was a mess. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart would race, hoping it was Frank with an update. But for a while, There was nothing, just silence. Meanwhile, Mags had moved out of the house and was staying with a friend. We hadn't spoken since our confrontation, and part of me was grateful for the distance. But another part of me couldn't stop wondering what she was doing, where she was, and if she was still seeing B. The thought of her with him made my blood boil. Then one evening, just as I was about to give up hope, my phone rang. It was Frank. "Jake, I've got something for you," he said, his voice serious. "Can you meet me at my office tomorrow morning?" My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, sure. What did you find?" "I'd rather tell you in person," he replied, "but let's just say, it's not good." The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. What could be worse than what I already knew? What had Frank found that he couldn't tell me over the phone? The next morning, I arrived at Frank's office bright and early. He was waiting for me, a thick folder on his desk. He gestured for me to sit, his expression grave. "Jake, I've been following Mags for the past few weeks, and I've dug into her background like you asked," he began, flipping open the folder. "It turns out this affair with B, it's been going on a lot longer than you think. And it's not just some fling, it's serious." He handed me a stack of photos, images of Mags and B together, at the bar, at the beach, even in what looked like his apartment. The dates on the photos went back months, even before I'd started to suspect anything. I felt sick to my stomach. How could she do this?" I muttered, my voice shaking. "There's more," Frank said, pulling out a document. "I did some digging on B. His real name is Brian Collins, and he's got a record. Assault, theft, even some drug charges. He's bad news, Jake." I stared at the document in disbelief. She's been seeing this guy? This criminal? Why? "Who knows?" Frank shrugged. "But whatever the reason, she's in deep. And from what I've seen, it doesn't look like she's planning on ending things with him anytime soon." My hands trembled as I looked through the evidence. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about Mags throwing away everything we had for some lowlife. It was about betrayal on a level I hadn't even imagined. Frank leaned forward, his voice low and serious. "Jake, I don't know what your next move is, but whatever you decide, be careful. This guy's dangerous." I nodded, my mind spinning with the possibilities. I wasn't just dealing with a cheating wife anymore. I was dealing with a full-blown crisis, and the storm was only just beginning. The days that followed my meeting with Frank were some of the hardest of my life. Knowing that Mags had been involved with a man like Brian, a man with a criminal record, made everything feel even more surreal. I kept going over every detail in my mind, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing added up. How could the woman I'd spent years of my life with be capable of this? I tried to focus on work, burying myself in projects and meetings, but it was impossible to escape the thoughts that plagued me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the photos Frank had shown me, the two of them together, laughing, touching, kissing. The images were burned into my brain, tormenting me day and night. And then there was the fear. Frank had warned me that Brian was dangerous, and I knew I had to be careful. But that didn't stop the constant worry that something terrible was about to happen. Every time I left the house, I found myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see Brian lurking in the shadows. But the worst part of it all was the loneliness. Mags had been my partner, my confidant, the person I turned to when things got tough. Now, she was the source of my pain, and I had no one to lean on. The isolation was suffocating, and I found myself sinking deeper into despair with each passing day. It was in this dark state of mind that I made a decision. I needed to confront Mags again, not with anger or accusations, but with the truth. I needed to understand why she had done this, and I needed to hear it from her own lips. Maybe, just maybe, there was something left to salvage. So I reached out to her, sending a message that was as calm and composed as I could manage. "Mags, we need to talk. Can you meet me at the house tomorrow evening?" To my surprise, she replied almost immediately, "Okay, I'll be there." The next day was a blur. I could barely focus on anything, my mind consumed with what was about to happen. By the time evening rolled around, I was a nervous wreck, pacing the living room as I waited for her to arrive. When the door finally opened and she walked in, my heart skipped a beat. She looked tired, worn down, and for a brief moment I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "Jake," she said softly, standing in the doorway. "What do you want to talk about?" I gestured for her to sit down, taking a deep breath to steady myself. I want to know why, Mags. Why him? Why this? She sat down on the edge of the couch, her eyes downcast. I don't know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It just happened. Bullshit, I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. This didn't just happen, Mags. You made a choice. You chose to betray me, to throw everything we had away for some criminal. She flinched at the harshness of my words, but she didn't argue. Instead, she just sat there, staring at the floor, her hands trembling in her lap. I need to understand, I said, my voice softer now. What does he have that I don't? What made you do this? For a long moment, she didn't respond. When she finally looked up at me, her eyes were filled with tears. I was lonely, Jake, she said, her voice breaking. You were always so busy with work, so distant. And Brian, he made me feel alive again. He made me feel like I mattered. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. All the anger, all the resentment I'd been holding on to suddenly felt small in the face of her pain. I'd been so focused on my own hurt that I hadn't considered hers, but that didn't make what she'd done right. I'm sorry you felt that way, I said, my voice strained. But that doesn't justify what you did. You should have talked to me, Mags. We could have worked through this together. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know, I messed up, Jake. I messed up so bad, and I don't know how to fix it. I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for so long, and felt a deep sadness settle over me. Maybe there was no fixing this. Maybe some things were just too broken to be repaired. But one thing was certain. This was the beginning of the end. After our conversation, things between Mags and me became even more strained. She moved out completely, staying with a friend while we figured out the next steps. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was only to discuss practical matters, dividing assets, finalizing the separation. The love we once shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by a cold, painful reality. But the more I tried to distance myself from the situation, the more I found myself drawn back into it. The thought of Mags being with Brian, of her choosing him over me, gnawed at me constantly. I couldn't let it go. I needed closure, and I needed to make sure she was safe. Despite everything, I still cared about her. That's when I made a risky decision. I started following Brian. It wasn't hard to find out where he lived. Frank's report had given me all the information I needed. I began tailing him, keeping a safe distance, trying to figure out what kind of man he really was. At first, it was just a matter of curiosity. I wanted to see for myself what kind of life Mags had been drawn into. But the more I watched, the more I realized how dangerous Brian really was. He had a network of shady associates, people who looked like they were involved in all kinds of illegal activities. Drugs, theft, maybe even worse. And Mags was right in the middle of it. One night, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Brian was meeting with a group of men in a dark alley behind a club. They were exchanging something. Money, drugs, I wasn't sure what. But the tension in the air was palpable. It was clear that this was serious business, and not the kind you walked away from easily. As I watched from the shadows, I realized just how deep Mags had gotten herself into this mess. She wasn't just involved with a criminal. She was entangled in a dangerous web that could easily spiral out of control. I knew I had to do something, but I wasn't sure what. Going to the police crossed my mind, but I didn't have enough evidence. All I had were my suspicions, and a gut feeling that things were about to get a lot worse. And then there was Mags. Despite everything she'd done, despite all the pain she'd caused me, I couldn't just abandon her. I had to protect her, even if she didn't want my help. But how? What could I do against a man like Brian and his cronies? The more I thought about it, the more desperate I became. I started considering options I'd never have thought possible before. Breaking into Brian's place, gathering evidence myself, even confronting him directly. But each idea felt more reckless than the last. I was out of my depth, and I knew it. But I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Mags had made her choices, but that didn't mean she deserved to be dragged down with Brian. I had to find a way to get her out of this mess before it was too late. As I continued to watch Brian from the shadows, I made a decision. I was going to play a dangerous game, one that could either save Mags or destroy us both. With every passing day, the tension in my life ratcheted up another notch. The sense of impending doom was nearly unbearable, and I could feel myself slipping further into an abyss I didn't know how to escape. But I was committed now. There was no turning back. One night I decided to take the next step. I had no solid plan, just a desperate need to do something, anything, to pull Mags out of the situation she was in. I knew Brian's schedule well enough by now, and I knew there were times when he was away, likely meeting with his associates. That's when I'd make my move. I waited until I was sure Brian had left for the evening, then drove to his apartment. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the building, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I ignored the fear and pressed on. If I was going to save Mags, I had to do this. Breaking in was easier than I expected. The lock on Brian's door was cheap, and with a little bit of finesse, I managed to get inside. The apartment was dark and smelled faintly of cigarettes and sweat. My hands shook as I rummaged through his belongings, searching for anything that could help me understand what Mags had gotten herself into. Or, better yet, something I could use to convince her to leave him. The place was a mess. Clothes strewn across the floor, empty beer bottles lining the countertops, and papers scattered everywhere. I sifted through them, finding bills, receipts, and notes, but nothing that seemed particularly damning. I was starting to think this had been a mistake when I found a small black notebook shoved under a stack of magazines. Flipping through it, I quickly realized it was a ledger of sorts. Names, dates, amounts of money, and cryptic symbols that didn't make sense to me. But one name stood out: Mags. There were several entries under her name, and the amounts of money next to them made my blood run cold. Whatever Brian was involved in, Mags was in deep. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, and I froze, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. Brian was back, and I was trapped. As the door creaked open, panic surged through me. I was trapped in Brian's apartment with no way out, and the notebook in my hand suddenly felt like a ticking time bomb. I scrambled to find a hiding spot, my mind racing as I heard footsteps approaching. I ducked into a nearby closet, pulling the door shut just as Brian entered the room. From the sliver of light between the closet doors, I could see him moving through the apartment. He looked agitated, muttering to himself as he tossed his keys onto the table and yanked off his jacket. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't come near the closet. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he'd hear it. For what felt like an eternity, Brian paced the room, his frustration growing with each step. I could tell something was bothering him, something serious. He was on edge, and that made him even more dangerous. As he finally slumped onto the couch, lighting a cigarette, I knew I had to get out of there before he decided to search his apartment for whatever was bothering him. Carefully, I inched the closet door open just enough to peek out. Brian was engrossed in his thoughts, his back to me as he stared blankly at the wall. It was now or never. I had to make my move. With the stealthiest steps I could manage, I slipped out of the closet and crept towards the door. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, praying it wouldn't squeak. As I slowly turned it, I could feel every muscle in my body tensing, ready to bolt the moment I had a chance. But just as I was about to slip out, Brian's phone rang. The sudden sound startled both of us, and for a split second I was sure he'd turn around and see me. But instead, he grabbed his phone and answered with a gruff, "What?" I used the distraction to my advantage, opening the door just enough to slide through and make my escape. I didn't stop to catch my breath until I was safely back in my car, parked a few blocks away. My hands were still trembling as I clutched the steering wheel, the adrenaline coursing through my veins making it hard to think straight. I couldn't believe I'd gotten out of there without being caught. But as the adrenaline faded, the reality of what I'd just done hit me. I had Brian's notebook, and with it, proof that Mags was involved in something far more dangerous than I'd imagined. The amounts of money, the cryptic symbols, it was clear that Brian was using her for something illegal, something that could get her into serious trouble. I knew I had to act fast. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. It was time to confront Mags with what I'd found and make her see the danger she was in. But first I needed to figure out exactly what I was dealing with. I needed help. There was only one person I could think of who might be able to help me make sense of the notebook: Frank. He had the experience, the connections, and most importantly, he had a vested interest in getting Brian off the streets. I just hoped he'd be willing to help me again. With a deep breath, I started the car and headed to Frank's office, clutching the notebook like a lifeline. Frank's office was in a seedy part of town, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions and didn't expect answers. I parked in a dark alley nearby, trying to keep a low profile as I made my way to his door. The neon sign above the entrance flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. When Frank opened the door, his expression was a mix of surprise and concern. "Jake, what the hell are you doing here?" he asked, glancing around as if expecting trouble. I didn't waste any time. "I need your help," I said, holding up the black notebook. "I found this in Brian's apartment. I think it's some kind of ledger, and Mags's name is all over it. I don't know what any of it means, but it's bad, Frank. Real bad." Frank's eyes widened as he took the notebook from me, flipping through the pages. His face grew more serious with each passing second, and when he finally looked up at me, I could see the gravity of the situation reflected in his eyes. "This is serious," he muttered, closing the notebook and shoving it into his coat pocket. "Brian's mixed up in some heavy stuff, and it looks like Mags is right in the middle of it. You were right to come to me, Jake. We need to handle this carefully." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperation. "I just want to get Mags out of this mess before it's too late." Frank nodded, his expression grim. "First, we need to figure out exactly what Brian's up to and how Mags is involved. This ledger is a start, but it's not enough. We need more evidence, something concrete we can take to the cops. But that means digging deeper, and that's going to be dangerous." I swallowed hard, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. "I'll do whatever it takes, Frank. Just tell me what to do." Frank studied me for a moment as if gauging my resolve. "All right," he finally said, "but you need to be prepared for whatever we find. This could get ugly, Jake, and once we start down this path, there's no turning back." I nodded, steeling myself for what lay ahead. "I understand. Let's do it." Frank wasted no time getting to work. He pulled out his phone and made a few calls, arranging for some of his contacts to start digging into Brian's background and activities. As he worked, he explained the plan to me in more detail. We'd gather as much information as possible, build a solid case against Brian, and then go to the authorities. But we had to move fast. Brian wasn't the type to let loose ends dangle for long. As the hours ticked by, the gravity of the situation began to sink in even more. I was putting myself, and possibly Mags, in serious danger by going after Brian like this. But I couldn't back down now. I was in too deep, and the only way out was to see this through to the end. When Frank finally hung up the phone, he turned to me with a determined look. "We've got a lead," he said. "One of my contacts just sent over some intel. Brian's planning something big, and it's going down soon. If we're going to stop him and save Mags, we need to move fast." My heart raced as I listened to Frank's plan. This was it, the moment of truth. Everything we'd been working towards was coming to a head, and the outcome was anything but certain. But one thing was clear. There was no turning back now. Frank's plan was risky, but it was our best shot at taking Brian down and getting Mags out of his clutches. The intel Frank had gathered pointed to a major deal going down at a warehouse near the docks, one that would bring Brian and his crew together in one place. If we could get solid evidence of their criminal activities, we'd have enough to put Brian away for good, and more importantly, to prove that Mags was being coerced into her involvement. The night of the operation, I could barely keep my hands steady as I drove to the rendezvous point. Frank had arranged for backup, some trusted friends from his days on the force, guys who knew how to handle themselves in a situation like this. They'd be stationed around the warehouse, ready to move in as soon as we had what we needed. When I arrived, Frank was already there, going over the final details with the team. He pulled me aside, his expression serious. "You sure you're ready for this, Jake? Once we're in, there's no room for hesitation. We've got to be quick and precise, or this could all go south fast." I nodded, swallowing my fear. "I'm ready, Frank. Let's do this." We moved into position, using the cover of darkness to approach the warehouse undetected. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. I could see the dim lights of the warehouse in the distance, the silhouettes of men moving inside. As we got closer, Frank signaled for us to stop. He handed me a pair of binoculars, and I peered through them, scanning the scene. Inside the warehouse, Brian was at the center of it all, surrounded by his crew. They were loading crates onto a truck, likely filled with whatever illegal goods they were trafficking. But it wasn't just the sight of Brian that made my blood run cold. It was Mags. She was there, standing off to the side, her face pale and drawn. She looked scared, like she was in way over her head. Seeing her like that tore at me, but it also steeled my resolve. I couldn't let her go down with Brian. I had to get her out of there. Frank gave the signal, and we moved in, creeping closer to the warehouse. My heart pounded in my chest as we reached the edge of the building, close enough to hear the voices inside. Frank's team was in place, ready to move at a moment's notice. But just as we were about to make our move, things took a turn for the worse. One of Brian's men stepped outside for a smoke, spotting us in the shadows. He yelled out a warning, and suddenly, everything erupted into chaos. Frank and his team sprang into action, storming the warehouse as shots rang out. I could hear the shouts of Brian's men, the scuffle of boots on concrete as they scrambled to fight back. But my focus was on one thing, getting to Mags. I darted inside, dodging between crates and ducking under cover as bullets whizzed past. I saw Brian grab Mags, using her as a human shield as he backed towards the exit. My blood boiled at the sight, but I knew I had to keep a cool head. "Let her go, Brian," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the chaos. But Brian just sneered, tightening his grip on her. He was cornered, and that made him even more dangerous. Frank's team was closing in, but Brian was too quick. He shoved Mags aside and made a break for it, slipping out through a side door. I raced after him, my pulse pounding in my ears as I chased him into the night. I sprinted after Brian, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I raced through the darkened streets behind the warehouse. The night was eerily quiet, the chaos inside fading into the background as I focused solely on catching him. Brian was fast, but desperation fueled my every step, pushing me beyond my usual limits. As I turned a corner, I saw him ahead, ducking into an alley. I followed, my heart pounding as I entered the narrow passageway. The alley was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and foreboding. Brian was crouched at the end, looking over his shoulder, his face twisted in a mix of anger and fear. "Brian!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the walls. "It's over! You're not getting away!" Brian spun around, his eyes wide with panic. He pulled a gun from his coat pocket, aiming it at me with a shaky hand. "Stay back, Jake. This isn't your fight. You don't know what you're messing with." I stopped in my tracks, my heart racing. The sight of the gun made my blood run cold, but I couldn't back down now. "Let Mags go, Brian. She's not a part of this. You're the one I want." Brian's grip on the gun tightened. "You think you're some kind of hero? You have no idea what's really going on here. Mags is in this as deep as I am." I shook my head, frustration boiling over. "You're using her, Brian. She's scared, and you're dragging her into your mess. I'm not letting you get away with this." Brian's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but his fear quickly turned to anger. "You don't know anything. Get out of here before you get hurt." Before I could react, Brian fired a shot, the bullet hitting the wall inches from where I stood. I flinched, ducking behind a dumpster as Brian moved further down the alley looking for another escape route. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, signaling that Frank's team was closing in. I had to make a choice. Keep chasing Brian or ensure Mags was safe. My gut told me to focus on Mags, but I couldn't leave Brian to escape. I had to make sure he was caught and couldn't harm her or anyone else. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to follow Brian. The sirens were getting closer, and I knew I needed to catch him before the police arrived. I ran through the alley, dodging debris and keeping a close eye on Brian as he stumbled through the maze of narrow streets. Finally, we reached a dead end, a brick wall with no way out. Brian turned to face me, his expression a mix of desperation and defiance. "This is it, Jake. You've got me cornered, but you won't stop me from finishing what I started." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "It's over, Brian. You're going to jail, and Mags is getting out of this. It's time to face the consequences." Before Brian could react, the sound of approaching footsteps and flashing lights signaled the arrival of the police. Brian's face contorted in a snarl as he turned to run, but it was too late. The police swarmed into the alley, surrounding him and forcing him to the ground. I watched from the sidelines, my heart heavy with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Brian was handcuffed and led away, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and defeat. The police officers began questioning me, taking my statement and gathering evidence. I watched as they took Brian's gun and the stolen goods, the reality of the night's events settling over me. Mags was safe, but the damage had been done. The life we'd built together was irrevocably shattered, and there was no going back. As the police finished their work, and Brian was loaded into a patrol car, I felt a deep sense of exhaustion. The fight was over, but the scars would remain. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of emotions. Brian's arrest made headlines, and the case was all over the news. Mags was shaken but safe, and I tried to focus on making sure she had the support she needed. We hadn't spoken much since the warehouse incident, but I knew she needed time to process everything. I spent most of my days working with Frank and the police, providing information and assisting with the investigation. Brian's criminal network was being dismantled piece by piece, and the evidence we'd gathered was proving crucial in bringing down the operation. Despite the progress, the sense of loss was overwhelming. My life had been turned upside down, and the future felt uncertain. I kept thinking about Mags and the life we had before everything fell apart. I wanted to believe that time would heal the wounds, but I knew it wouldn't be that simple. One evening, after the dust had settled and the initial chaos had died down, I decided to reach out to Mags. I sent her a message asking if we could meet. I needed closure, and I hoped that talking with her might help both of us move forward. She agreed to meet, and we chose a quiet cafe, a neutral ground where we could talk without distractions. When she arrived, she looked tired but composed. We sat down at a table in the corner, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry, Jake," she said softly, her eyes filled with tears. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I was lost, and I didn't know how to fix it." I nodded, trying to keep my emotions in check. "I know. I understand that things got out of control, but it's too late to fix what's been broken." We talked for a while, sharing our thoughts and feelings about the events that had transpired. It was painful, but it was also a necessary step in the healing process. We both knew that our relationship was beyond repair, but we parted on relatively good terms, each of us finding a measure of closure in the conversation. As I left the cafe, I felt a mixture of sadness and relief. The path ahead was uncertain, but I knew I had to keep moving forward. The past would always be a part of me, but I had to find a way to rebuild my life and find a new direction. With Brian's arrest and the dismantling of his criminal network, there was a glimmer of hope that things might get better. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars of the past would take time to heal, but I was determined to face the future with strength and resilience. And as I walked away from the cafe, I knew that despite everything, I was ready to embrace whatever came next.